Hello, I'm James Temperton, digital editor at Wired UK, and joining me today is Ramachander, Chief Commercial Officer of the social innovation business at Hitachi Europe. Today, we're going to be exploring the challenges for social innovation and how technology can help us transition to a more economically and environmentally sustainable society. Ram, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. Could you tell us a little bit about your role and Hitachi's work in the social innovation business space?
Thanks, James. So my role essentially as a Chief Commercial Officer in the EMEA region is to incubate new digital businesses that impact society in a positive way. So if you think about social innovation is essentially embedded in Hitachi's 110-year history to improve society through technological innovation. Now, we're an engineering conglomerate that owns quite a lot of infrastructure, but we're also a big digital organization that aims to bring our operational technology and our digital technology together for us to be able to optimize social infrastructure. So I'll go through some examples of that as we go down. But in my team, what we tend to do is to have an incubation unit that looks at what are the future major disruptive elements. So whether it's climate change or any of the sustainable development goals that we see coming through the UN for clean water, industrial infrastructure, healthcare, etc., and tries to bring our capabilities as a conglomerate, overlay digital elements such as IoT, AI, to be able to optimize and look at how we can improve society as we go forward. We're very commercially driven as a unit. So my unit is responsible for incubating and launching businesses that have the potential to become billion-dollar businesses down the line. But however, in our role, we also look at the impact on the environment, the impact on society as an entirety as we move forward.
So let's break those down. Can you talk me through the economic, environmental, and societal issues at play here? So how is Hitachi defining social innovation and those separate components of it?
Yeah, so let's start with the societal aspect. Okay, so one of the things that we look at is our chairman has termed this fantastic theme as Society 5.0. So what does the future digital society look like? On how we communicate, how we travel, and how we use health, etc., etc. How does digital enable our society to benefit from all of the things that we can bring to the table? So we then focus. So it's very people-centric in its outcome. We're a B2B corporation, but we ultimately are impacting how society will change through the infrastructure that we implement. For even whether it's trains that we build. How do we ensure the mobility on our trains are much more comfortable, safer as we go forward under the current environment? How do we bring all of that together using digital? The second piece we look at is we're very much focused on ecosystems. So the complex nature of how society interacts is quite important as we go forward, or even businesses interconnect or value chains are transforming. To give you an example there, if you look at how we, electrification of mobility as a great example, okay? Up until this point, we're used to getting into a vehicle, going to a petrol station and fueling our vehicles through petrol or diesel, etc. And it's a relatively simple relationship that we have, and obviously not great for the climate. As we move into electrification, that relationship becomes a lot more complex. We're now moving into a new relationship with the energy grid and a vehicle. So how do we manage that future ecosystem that has had a very simple linear value chain in the past to this complex relationship between the energy grid, charging infrastructure, the vehicle, batteries, and obviously then the reciprocal impact that it has on carbon emissions? We look at that entirety impact and start to build out ecosystems that manage all of those positive impacts that we can have on society, whilst keeping an eye on what potential negative impacts can this transition have, and how do we mitigate those things as we go forward.
What do specific examples of this new approach look like in the world today, and how can they help us to understand what the world will look like in the years to come?
So let me talk about a program that we're running called Optimize Prime, which is an EV-centric program, which is an innovation program that we're like 2 years into now. It's a 4-year program that we're working with Ofgem and UK Power Networks to look at what does the future of an electrified mobility look like against our grid infrastructure. So the ultimate aim of this program is to say, what is the impact on the grid by connecting thousands, hundreds of thousands of EVs to it, and how do we look at systemic change in a way that optimizes what we have today and give us the right kind of ideas of what we plan. So we're working in a consortium. Hitachi is leading a consortium of partners that include Uber, British Gas Centrica, Royal Mail, Scottish Southern Electric, UK Power Networks, and obviously reporting into Ofgem on the findings that we're doing. Now, what we're doing here is we are looking at several use cases. Okay, so we're looking at how do we manage connectivity to the grid from your home. So in the case of British Gas Centrica, their engineering vehicles go home. So that we're looking at how do we manage that. How do you manage connectivity to the grid to charge vehicles in depots where Royal Mail have vehicles going back? And how do you manage connectivity to the grid and charging using taxis, which are very dependent on off-street charging capability? So we're using these different scenarios that we're building to look at what impact it has on the grid itself. So we're looking at what do companies, especially commercial vehicles, have to do to be able to electrify. So it's important that we help them think about what are the strategies, what is the total cost of ownership, what is the impact on your ability to maintain your business, how do you route optimize if you're Royal Mail, how do you charge just enough to be able to be economic, but also how do you use the infrastructure that you're putting into your depot to support the grid infrastructure? Because a charger that you're implementing into your depot can act as a battery in itself. Then we're also working with the utilities to say, hey, look, we're now understanding the impact of managing demand and supply using data, from the grid to the vehicle. What kind of investments do you need to make to think about upgrading your grid, to be able to meet the new demand that are coming from transportation? So in this program, for instance, one of the targets that we have is potentially saving hundreds of millions in grid investment infrastructure by having a much deeper understanding through data and AI and how do you optimize demand and supply. And secondly, how do you help organization transition to EV more effectively so that we can take tons and tons of carbon emissions off the environment. So we have a target on, I think, a couple of million tons of carbon. If this program works well and it's implemented across the country, we can have that kind of impact on the environment as well as the economy.
So what you're saying is to really make this change, and it's a huge change that we have to make as a society and as businesses and as governments, is you've got to look at the whole ecosystem. You can't change one bit without looking at all the other bits that it relies on. Has that been a key learning that Hitachi's made as it looks to roll out more of these sort of programs?
Absolutely. I mean, it is really, there is no, when you look at these kind of big systemic changes that we need to implement that impacts environment, society, and potentially as a business, because we're a business, we need to think about how do we build profitable businesses as we go through. We need to collaborate with a lot of other partners. So everything that I do in the social innovation business is to look at who are the key players that we need to work with. We work on what we call co-creation mode. So one of the first things that we do is we don't go into a darkened lab and go, oh, let's work this out from a Hitachi point of view. We look at what is the market in view? What is the voice of the customer? What is the voice of the different future players in this ecosystem? And how we, as an infrastructure player, because we have Hitachi ABB Power Grid, so we have that kind of capability. We have our mobility business. We have an automotive business. We have a business in Hitachi Capital? How do we bring all of that capability together? And then how do we add to that ecosystem to create a holistic systemic change in the countries we will operate in on a global level?
Everyone realizes that the urgency of these challenges and the need to act now and act in the right way. And there's definitely been mistakes made in the past by governments, by businesses. What can we learn from those mistakes, and what do we need to start doing differently as we start to scale this new way of building infrastructure, building businesses, and building our society?
Yeah, that's a big question, right? it's one of the key things that what the way we look at it. As I said, at the top level as a company, we have this ethos of social innovation. I think one of the things that companies need to think about is, in addition to your bottom line, your shareholder value, all of the things that now I've worked in Silicon Valley. I've done a lot of startups with classic models of build the next Google, to scale it, let's kind of sell it, kind of that linear pathway of building digital businesses. That there's a formula for that. As we know, these digital businesses can have massive impact on the future of society because they touch their ability to proliferate across society is unique in what we do. So therefore, we need to start to think about, when we start to build these kind of businesses, what are the positive and the negative impacts that we can have as we go forward as early as possible in your innovation stage, which is why we kind of have this approach of thinking about all of the elements of the ecosystem. Then start to push forward with the positive impacts and start to think about mitigating any potential negative impacts in your modeling of your business as you go forward. So firstly, have the ethos in your business that's more than just profitability, important, very important in profitability, shareholder value, company reputation, etc. Very at the heart of what we do, but also really think about how can what you do have a positive impact on society as you go forward, because it's not just great for society, it's great for your business, right? Because you then become a much more sustainable, long-standing business, because as a brand, you're having that positive kind of influence on everything they're doing. It then improves the ability for shareholders to invest in you, etc., etc. So I think that's quite important.
And what role does Hitachi have to play in our transition to decarbonisation in the future? You've touched on it a number of times, but let's get back to the specifics. What work is Hitachi doing right now, and what work is Hitachi hoping and planning to do in the future that will ensure it has a key role in this transition?
It's a good question. We're doing a lot today. As a big conglomerate, global conglomerate, it's surprising how many things that we are doing that have a positive impact on, like, our scope 3, on our emissions, and i.e. our customers' activity in what we're doing. A good example is, for instance, with my team, we ran a program on the Isles of Scilly. For those of you that don't know where that is, an archipelago off of Cornwall, where we did a smart island project. Okay, so we looked at on the island itself, there are a number of challenges around the price of energy being higher because they're a remote island. They have grid infrastructure going in from the mainland, which is quite old. And we looked at how can we create a more reduce carbon emissions on the island, but also reduce the energy price for residents of the island because it's higher than on the mainland. So that's a good example of us having an impact in projects that we're doing today. And what we look to do with those kind of projects is to take that kind of project and scale it. Now, if you take that impact that we had on reducing energy prices to reduce energy poverty, reduce carbon emissions, but also build a viable business of that, how do we then scale that into much bigger municipalities in the UK, but also take it globally in terms of what we do? So there are a number of programs across the world that Hitachi runs that have those kind of positive impacts. And one of the things we're starting to look at now is how can we look at all of these programs globally and start to look at how we can sort of replicate them to other geographies, etc. So from a carbon emissions point of view, we're in the process of really understanding all of these programs and then starting to set a northern star around where are the biggest impacts that we can have in the programs that we do, and how do we scale these and replicate these down the line. So that's how we're looking at it. In the future, if you take, for instance, what I talked about in EV, of the programs that we've done for the last couple of years around how do you electrify light commercial vehicles and even buses as we go to public transportation, we're now building a business that has an ambition to grow to this kind of billion-dollar business with the ecosystem that we built. And how many vehicles can we get under management and to transition into EV? So we're now pushing this incubated business into a commercial world and setting up a team to build an entire organization and working with our Hitachi Capital friends, etc., to build a business that takes significant amounts of vehicles into transition into EV. So that's a good example of how we're taking what we're doing today, taking account of what we're doing today, and then building a business into the future.
And that's a project at a small scale. What about scaling that project on the Isle of Scilly up to a larger scale? What are the different challenges as you grow those kinds of projects and look to introduce them in cities and larger urban areas?
Yeah, good question. One of the first challenges around capital investment. So when you take a program like that to a local authority, there's quite a lot of capital infrastructure that needs to be implemented for us to be able to gain the benefit of what we're doing. So that's why we work with our Hitachi Capital colleagues, who can, as an organization, we can help fund that infrastructure up front and come up with a new way of commercializing that. So that's one of the challenges. So in the work that we do, we look for new commercial models that enable us to be able to deliver benefit and get return from that at a scalable level. So investment in the infrastructure is one of the challenges, especially at systemic level, and especially in times like these where the focus of government investment is around other areas. But I feel this kind of infrastructure development holds a massive ticket to the future of the economy. Yeah, so the UK can certainly become a leader in the future as an environmental champion, as we're hearing, in building these kind of new EV economies. So that's one of the key challenges around capital investment. That's how we're overcoming it, to come up with new ways of funding, new ways of returning investment from this. The second piece is around optimization of this complex ecosystem. So we're now moving from one kind of sets of relationship, as I said earlier, to new kinds of relationships that haven't really interconnected before. So one of the things that we do sitting on top of this thing is to start to look at what are the impacts, how do these new relationships get formed, how do we create the flow of the future of this kind of, how does the grid and the transportation system work together where it's never worked together before, right? So how does that work smoothly? How do we make sure that that transition is happening effectively? How does this systemic change? And that involves government as well. So it's not just about private sector impact in this. It's quite important that government is involved in this kind of policy change that enables us to create a smooth transition. So we need government, we need commercial, we need commerce, we need businesses, and we need new ecosystems to get involved. The third is around having enough innovation. There's plenty of technology to make things happen, right? So today, when you look at mass scale, there are lots of point solutions that solve pieces of the puzzle, okay? So when you look at electrification of vehicles, there's lots of charge point technologies that optimize one element of what we're doing. Again, we need to put all of this together in one systemic world and aggregate and manage at the top level. So you need organizations like Hitachi, big infrastructure conglomerate like ours, who are used to managing these big programs and driving those forward, who can invest in them, whilst bringing in fantastic innovation from startups, from SMEs, because quite a lot of really great innovation in this world is happening at that level. So we need to interconnect that innovation world with big engineering companies like us, who are good at innovation, but we're a bit slower, right, than the agile, fast startup. So in my business, in the SIB business, we act like a startup inside a set of startups inside of a big engineering conglomerate. So we bring that ethos of agility, fail fast, move to the next thing, pivot, all of the fantastic things that great digital innovators are good at into a big engineering conglomerate like this.
Let's focus back on zero carbon and mobility. It's an area we've touched on a few times. I think people have got a fairly good grasp on the idea that the next car they buy might be electric, or they might start riding trains that are powered by renewable energy, or getting on a bus that's electric as well. These things are already out there. But what steps need to be taken to make that something that maybe we see a few times to something that is completely normal? And how important is data and interpreting data from these huge new systems that we build to working out how we build that new, more sustainable transportation system?
So I'll sort of break your question down into two there. One is, how important is data, and how do we get transition to, for instance, something like zero carbon transportation as a normal, much broader kind of thing. So if I take the second part of the question on how important is data, data is absolutely critical for us to be able to transition to the future EV environment. There are so many interdependencies that we need to understand through data. The data is readily available. So whether a charger in the grid, in the vehicle, telematics providing you with lots of data, it's quite important that we kind of pinpoint what problem we're trying to solve. So if you take the Optimized Prime program, we had 3 challenges that we wanted to look at. How do you create systemic change in the energy grid to be able to, in the right way, to be able to meet the demand of EVs? So we know what kind of data we need. We need to manage demand and supply. So we need to understand what is the demand of the vehicle, what is the supply capability of the grid, and what is the strain at the grid at any single point, so we can manage that effectively, that relationship. Secondly, we were looking at how quickly can we transition the commercial vehicle environment into EV. So how can we help them make those decisions faster? And we knew that would be driven by economics. So we looked at data around, what is the cost today to operate a commercial fleet? What is the cost today to operate an electric fleet? And what will it look like as this becomes more prolific? So we model what we call the total cost of ownership of the entire fleet and show them a pathway to transition from where they are today to where they need to be. Now, they don't go from having 5,000 diesel vehicles to 5,000 EVs overnight, because one, there isn't enough coming through the supply chain, so there needs to be more manufactured. And 2, they need to understand how this is all working and how it's impacting their business. So we're doing a number of pilots to prove to these commercial organizations that it's totally feasible, the economics stack up, there's no disruption to their business, there's supply, and the grid infrastructure works, and the charging infrastructure works. So the whole business model is working in that transition. So those are the things that will help us move forward. The energy grid being ready to be able to, the infrastructure being able to go forward. Without the infrastructure, we can't really transition. So we need to make sure that's ready. The economics are working for commercial organizations and buses, by the way. We're doing exactly the same with public transportation. How do you route optimize a battery charged vehicle as opposed to a diesel vehicle in a bus? And then the bigger macro challenge is, how do manufacturers speed up that? As they see the demand coming through, they can then get more confidence to transition to supplying more commercial vehicles as they go through. And we're seeing that anyway. And finally, legislation, right? Because government is pushing to zero carbon transition by 2030. So guys are getting prepared. So we are going to see that movement happening, and we're on that 10-year journey with our customers to be able to make sure they're ready for that transformation.
And then what does it look like for the end consumer, for you and me making a journey in 5, 10, 20 years' time? What's going to be fundamentally different about a mobility infrastructure that's based on these social innovation business projects? What's going to change between now and then that will feel really different when you're stepping out of your house?
Yes, that's a great question, right? Because it's quite interesting. There's an interesting statistic that's around that I think we utilize about 5 to 10% of our vehicle in total. Most of the time, it's sat in either your front car park or on the road or in a train station car park or somewhere else. So there's a big question around how do we optimize the usage of our vehicle so we're gaining more value from it? Because there's as a user. And there are potentially other uses of the vehicle in the future as we think about connected mobility, autonomous mobility, different ways of utilizing your vehicle as a consumer that our behavior will change as the next generation comes through. Do you need to own a vehicle? Yeah. Is it all about your journey as opposed to the car itself? I need to go from A to B. Can I have a vehicle available when I need it and whatever vehicle I need to have? And is my journey then like mobility as a service from my car to my train to my Uber to my location completely plannable through an app? And we call, as we talk about mobility as a service and connected mobility, all of that is being evaluated. So we're looking at that as well in terms of how do you share, as we get to the sharing economy, how do you share your vehicle and how do you manage and optimize the investment that you're making in your vehicle? So I think that's a big transition coming through. Obviously, we have autonomous in the middle of this as well as it starts to become more and more realistic. And that may change the relationship that we have with our vehicles as well. And electrification, obviously, is one element. So if you take connected mobility, sharing economy, autonomous, and electrification all coming together as a perfect storm, we will see what I think is a fundamental transformation of our relationship with our personal vehicle. I'd be quite happy not to have cars sitting in my front drive and have a vehicle available when I need it because there's so much downtime in that investment that I've made.
You mentioned the sharing economy and the potential key role that that's going to play in these big changes that we're going to experience over the coming years. What about the circular economy? How does that fit into these big economic, environmental, and societal changes that we're driving at the moment?
Yeah, I think it is important, for us to understand how we engage the circular economy. We need to understand our own relationship with our supply chain, with our products, and how that's how we're managing that materiality impact as we have good visibility around that. And I think then it goes back to this ecosystem play around how do we then connect to the rest of the ecosystem for us to be able to optimize everything that we build to its maximum. And a good example, for instance, is looking at second life batteries. Okay, so as we get more and more batteries into vehicles need high performing batteries. But as they get to second life, those same batteries can be utilized. Grids don't really need that level of high performance, but they could act as storage devices as a second life battery as we go forward. So thinking through, again, this kind of ecosystem approach to what we're doing, thinking into the future as well, we can start to think about the things that we're putting into play and optimizing that in a way that we're creating our steps towards a circular economy. And I think it's a big question, it's a big challenge. Organizations like us, engineering, manufacturing, organizations like ours, have got a lot to do around making sure that element is closed off. That loop is closed off in the circular economy, as you say.
With the circular economy, what are the key blockers to making sure that it has an impact and is part of this discussion that we're having about economic and environmental and societal change? Are there engineering challenges here? Is it legislative challenges? Is it business practice challenges? How can we make sure that the circular economy is a key component of these big systemic changes that we're trying to make?
Yeah, so we talked about legislative impact, that it has to be pretty firm and pretty clear in terms of driving organizations to have the right kind of behavior. And in Europe, by the way, in the UK and Europe, we're leaders in that. We're globally, because the amount of legislation that we have on carbon emissions management and sustainability, driving the UN sustainability goals into what we're doing, we're pretty good at that, and thinking ahead of it. In corporate behavior, I think it's quite important legislation does help corporate behavior because it pushes the right kind of decision making and the right kind of accounting and legal requirements on the corporation. But if you think about how corporations have to build these kind of societal and environmental things into their ethos, it's quite important to start at the top of the tree. Right? And in my experience, the CEO taking the mantle quite hard to say, or a senior executive driving the vision for how this company can transform itself, or any company can transform itself from the core focus to also being a champion in societal transformation and in carbon transformation, etc., is quite important. And from there permeates a range of different internal policies, whether it's investment decisions, whether it's looking at how they can use their business to create new business around zero carbon, because there's a huge amount of opportunity for companies to focus on zero carbon businesses going forward. So that kind of top level buy-in, pushing down the line to the middle management and then all the way down to the factory floor, and how we have the right behaviors, the right KPIs to ensure that we're energy efficient, we're carbon emissions efficient, as well as driving major policy change in what we're doing. And then finally, we definitely need to be very close to academia and the latest thinking on this. So it's important for us to be engaged with great organizations in the UK and Europe that are thinking big around climate change and understanding the science and incorporating that science into what we're doing as well.
So we've done quite well to get through a discussion about the future without mentioning the elephant in the room. The COVID-19 pandemic is front of everyone's minds at the moment. I didn't want it to dominate our conversation, but it is going to play a crucial role in shaping our future. But let's be specific when we're talking about COVID. How has it affected your work in this area, and what changes are you seeing coming over the horizon as we move into a post-pandemic world?
Tough to predict, right? We're living highly uncertain times, and we're learning all the time in what we're doing. If you look at the tech industry, which is where kind of, if I look at what I do in digital, I think it has, and you've heard this, I spoke to somebody the other day, and I said, he said, I went to bed March 2020 and woke up in April 2030, right? Because technological innovation that has been, we've always estimated will take time to move forward, as we're seeing right now through this interview, has just gone at 10 years faster, okay, in terms of take up. So tech, digital is an important aspect of how we adjust ourselves into the future. Now, we are going to go back to commuting. We are going to go back into offices. We will go back into the society that we're kind of familiar with. But whether we'll go back into it in the same way, with all of the understanding of innovation, technological innovation that changes our behaviors, I'm not sure. So is remote connectivity like this, activity like this? No, I think this is going to continue to grow whilst we go back to some level of normality in ourselves. Taking specific examples of, for instance, getting passengers back on the train. It's quite important for us for our business that we continue to commute, we continue to utilize. So how do we provide data to and provide lots of information to on your phone to say it's good time to travel, it's safer to travel, it's not congested, we've got optimal train loading, the train is on time, and giving you more information about your journey so that you're able to make better judgments, safer judgments, and continue to live your life in the way you want to do. So I think there's huge opportunity in this very difficult times for digital to have an impact on how society reconfigures itself and how it uses digital technology to be able to improve its life. Personally, I've never been busier, right? So in terms of what I do, we're meetings after meetings, and a lot of people will experience the same things, right? Moving into this world of Teams and Zoom, etc. We are spending quite a lot of time talking to each other, more than we normally would have done. However, is it totally effective? Is there a better way of doing this and reconfiguring it? So there'll be an adjustment from where we've got to with this to where we need to go as normality kicks back in. But I think digital is going to be fundamental to how we readjust society as we go forward.
And there's a note of optimism there, I think, isn't there? That there's been a huge amount of disruption as a result of the pandemic, and it's been a fairly awful year for a lot of reasons. But we've shown our ability to change and to adapt, and to do that really, really rapidly when presented with challenges. And when you're talking about the economic and environmental and societal challenges that we would have faced without COVID, but we now face more urgently, it shows our capacity to change, adopt new technologies, and innovate. And we're going to be able to not think our way out of this, but it's a challenge that we've shown that we can rise to in a lot of ways, and there's optimism there for the future.
I'm forever the optimist. So I definitely see us coming out of this. There are going to be some industries that are impacted really badly, and they are impacted today. So my optimism is balanced by a reflection on industries that are caught up in that moment where they're going to have to rethink themselves very quickly, and they can't rethink quickly enough without having significant impact on their business. So we're seeing that in certain industries quite effectively. And so therefore, yes, the digital thing is good, but there is impact on organizations that are not able to transform quickly enough, that we need to be kind of cognizant of as we go forward, and how are they supported to be able to survive, or even transition to the new world. So definitely an air of optimism around how we can come back into the new world with digital supporting our transformation, but also reflective on those businesses that are struggling to transform themselves quickly enough, without any fault of their own, just by the pure nature of this beast, if you like.
Yeah, cautious optimism is definitely the right tone to take. Ramachander, thanks so much for taking the time to speak to us today, and thanks to you for watching. Goodbye.
Pleasure.